Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight are the late legendary novelist Kurt Vonnegut and Susan Farrell. Ms. Farrell is a professor of English at the College of Charleston. She joined the college's faculty in 1993 after completing her graduate studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She specializes in contemporary American fiction and teaches a variety of courses on American literature, contemporary fiction, women's studies, and academic writing. During this episode, we're going to talk with Susan Farrell about the great novelist Kurt Vonnegut, after whom she wrote a biography and is at work on a second book about the author. She is also a founding member of the International Kurt Vonnegut Society. Her research during the past few years has focused largely on American war literature. Obviously, Kurt Vonnegut, one of the people who wrote about war in very different terms than so many other authors. And her most recent book is called Imagining Home, American War Fiction from Hemingway to 9/11. Susan Farrell, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I'm so pleased to have you. I booked you so months ago, and I've been waiting for this one to come around. I'm obviously a Kurt Vonnegut fan. I was telling you before we started recording that I've read one Kurt Vonnegut biography. That's And So It Goes, and I devoured it. Very interested in Kurt Vonnegut. And I have to say, I liked Kurt Vonnegut better before I read the biography than afterward. But, you know, he's, I think, fairly typical of authors and human beings in general. There's the good parts of them and the bad parts of them. Let's start, though, with what made you such a big fan of Kurt Vonnegut's work.
Yeah, you know, like a lot of people, I first read Kurt Vonnegut when I was in high school. My parents happened to have a copy of Breakfast of Champions on the shelf, so I read that, and you know, I was astonished, delighted. It was unlike anything I had read before. I didn't really study Kurt Vonnegut in college, but I read a lot of his books. I started incorporating Slaughterhouse Five into my course that I teach on contemporary American fiction at the College of Charleston. And then I agreed to write a book it's not a biography. It's got a small biographical section, but it's more of a sort of encyclopedic reference book to all of Kurt Vonnegut's works, essays, novels, short fiction, that kind of thing. So it's a pretty fat reference book to Kurt Vonnegut. And that's when I read everything he wrote, beginning to end. He actually died right before the book came out, and it's almost like losing a grandfather or something.
Yeah, I can imagine. So he is really, you read Kurt Vonnegut, and I think there's a lot of people who don't get him, and then there's people who are just, wow, this is somebody who's really different. What is it about his writing that turned you on? And a lot of other, he was very popular among college students, I remember. So
yes.
What do you think it is about Kurt Vonnegut? Because he does seem to be an original. He didn't actually, in your research. Well, let me hold that question up. Let me first of all, just what was it about Kurt Vonnegut that lit you up?
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I was very drawn to how simple and easy to read his prose is. Short sentences, often very short chapters. But that simplicity sort of, hides a real depth, I think, of not only emotion, but carefully thought out structures in his work. It's really hard to write in that almost childlike, naive voice. In some ways, his prose sounds easy, but it's, I think, very difficult to pull off. And there's a certain just originality, I think, in the language he uses, the way he describes things that you might not expect to hear in literary fiction. There's a certain irreverence about his work that was very appealing to me. But I think there's also just a sort of sense of kindness and compassion that you feel when reading his works that I think most people respond to, and that I certainly did.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about, was his originality. Was he an original, or did he take after someone, or was he strongly influenced by any other writer? Are there other writers out there that predate Kurt Vonnegut, mm-hmm. where you see some influence that bled over, or was he truly just an original?
Well, he was a biochemistry major in college, so he wasn't, he didn't study English literature formally. And I think he always felt a sort of lack or maybe disrespect from other writers and scholars because of that. But I do think that gave him an original voice. I mean, he is a great reader, and he has read, he read immensely. But I do think his voice is pretty original. I mean, I think you could definitely say he's influenced by Mark Twain in particular, his sort of irreverence, his using a very vernacular sounding language, his humor, and also I think his cynicism, especially in later life. Twain became sort of very disillusioned and cynical. And I think in Vonnegut's later years, he sort of became the same way. Less optimistic than he had been before. Not that he was ever all that optimistic to begin with, but
yeah, exactly. Well, having been in Dresden, having been in the war, mm-hmm. and having survived Dresden and seen the inhumanity of war, it was understandable that he had this dimension to his personality that was formed in the firebombing that went on there and such. Now you're also
can I just I'll just jump in a second here, but something, as I do more research on Vonnegut, I'm writing a book now that's specifically about the making of Slaughterhouse Five, and I've done a lot of research into fellow prisoners that were in the slaughterhouse with him, that have written reminiscences and those kinds of things. And one thing that's really been interesting to me in the course of this research is that in Slaughterhouse Five, Vonnegut really sort of, I think, downplayed just how awful it was for the American prisoners of war that were housed in that slaughterhouse in Germany. I mean, those guys were starving to death. Their skin was covered in sores. They had constant diarrhea. They worked in the worst of conditions. They were freezing cold. The guards beat them. I mean, when you read the real life experiences, it's shocking, because I don't think Vonnegut dwells on sort of, the real suffering that he experienced in Dresden.
Exactly. No, I get you completely. When I read it, it was he certainly softened the whole situation, but at the same time was communicating communicating the experience, but not making the reader go through the kind of a litany of the suffering. That's for a different kind of writing. That's for right. the a history book or what have you. Where they kept the American prisoners, that building was what? I forget now what that was.
It was a slaughterhouse.
It was an animal slaughterhouse, right?
An animal slaughterhouse. Where they were housed was in what used to be pens, where they kept the animals, as sort of a concrete building where they put the animals inside at night. And that's where they had bunk beds there. When the actual bombing occurred, which was on the night of February 13th, 1945, the men were actually taken out by the guards and led to a slaughterhouse that was adjacent to their quarters. And the slaughterhouse was underground, and that was a sort of cold meat storage for the carcasses of animals. And there were carcasses of animals, being there right in the slaughterhouse when he was there. But That's how he managed to survive the war, because there were almost zero air raid shelters in Dresden. They didn't expect Dresden to be bombed. They had not done a lot of preparation. So it was just sort of the circumstance of where he was housed and the ability to go into this really deep, safe, underground slaughterhouse area that allowed him to survive the war, the bombing.
Yeah. Only to emerge from there and see the horror of what was visited upon Dresden.
Mm-hmm.
So now you are the founding member of the International Kurt Vonnegut Society.
Yes.
Talk about the organization. What's its purpose? What does it do? What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, we're in a sort of a loose affiliation of scholars that are interested in Kurt Vonnegut, that write about Kurt Vonnegut, and that sort of want to cement his reputation for future generations, because, as I'm sure you know, writers fall in and out of the canon, what gets taught, what doesn't get taught. So part of our mission is to make sure that Kurt Vonnegut is remembered and read and written about, and remains an important writer in the canon. So there's a conference every year called the American Literature Association, and that's an organization that's made up of a lot of author groups. And I noticed there wasn't a Kurt Vonnegut group. So in about 2007, I started sending out email notices to all the Vonnegut scholars I could find and saying, would you like to come to the conference and start this, get started with this Vonnegut Society? So our aim is to educate people about Vonnegut. We do meet every year to present papers on Vonnegut. We maintain a website that includes research on Vonnegut, information about him, events coming up, that kind of thing.
Now, when you say a paper, like papers on Vonnegut, what do you mean by that? Do you mean these are scholars who have written a paper about Kurt Vonnegut? They've done some research and are focused in on some particular aspect of the author?
Yeah, that's it exactly. I mean, these are mostly college professors. So oftentimes when you're writing a scholarly article about an author, you'll try it out first at a conference. You'll write a conference paper, which is a little bit shorter. Everybody at the conference will read the paper. They can comment on it, give you feedback. So it's specialized, some aspect of Kurt Vonnegut's work or life that these papers will talk about. We usually have a theme or a suggested couple of themes at the conference that we might focus on. One of the ones upcoming is like Vonnegut and ecology, for instance. So it's a good way for scholars to sort of test out their work and get feedback from other scholars before they submit an article to some kind of scholarly journal for publication.
So Kurt Vonnegut won many awards during his career, but never, to my knowledge, never the Pulitzer or the National Book Award.
Nope.
Was he ever a finalist for those awards, to your knowledge?
I think he was probably longlisted for those awards. He did win. He won at least 2 Hugo Awards, which is sort of the biggest award for science fiction writing. He won Nebula Awards, which are also in science fiction. But yeah, he never did win National Book Award or Pulitzer or Nobel Prize, even though there was sometimes talk of him, being up for those awards. But yeah.
Well, when you say science fiction, didn't Kurt Vonnegut kind of bridle at the idea that he was a science fiction writer? That he actually said, people put me in the science fiction section of bookstores, but I'm not really a science fiction writer. Do I have that wrong?
He started out early sort of as more of a science fiction writer. His first 2 novels, Player Piano is his very first novel and sort of a dystopian novel. Sirens of Titan, his second novel, is set on a moon of Saturn called Titan, and involves space travel and those kinds of things. So I think early on he was pegged as a science fiction writer a little bit. And I don't think bridled at it might be a little too strong. I think he did say in a famous essay that being labeled a science fiction writer was like being like your work belonged in a urinal or something. But he said also that he he thought people should write about technology in their works. He said, how can a contemporary writer not write about refrigerators and things like that? That there was sort of a fear of technology in contemporary sort of literary fiction that he thought was foolish. But yeah, he sort of worked to get pulled out of that science fiction drawer. And certainly, by the time of Slaughterhouse Five, his reputation had changed quite significantly. I mean, some of his earlier works were published as trade paperbacks that had like lurid covers of half-dressed women and aliens and things like that were sold in bus depots and those kinds of things. It's very cheap paperback editions. And it wasn't until later in his career that some of his earlier works got picked up and re-released in hardback covers, and which gave them a little more respectability.
The place that he will occupy, and actually, before I even ask you that question, I'm curious. You use Kurt Vonnegut's material in the classroom yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that a little bit. You assign it to the students to read it, and then and do you discuss it like any other author? Is that the case?
Yes, I usually use Slaughterhouse Five in a class I teach on contemporary American fiction. We, in fact, begin the class with Slaughterhouse Five, and we'll move all the way up sort of to, some more contemporary books published very recently. But I've also taught classes on 20th century American war fiction. And in those classes, I'll sometimes have a unit on Hemingway, a whole unit on Vonnegut, a unit on Tim O'Brien, who writes about the Vietnam War, and then maybe a unit on 9/11 or sort of post 9/11 sort of war literature. So I've used him in multiple ways, but Slaughterhouse Five is certainly the book that I teach the most. And students love it to this day. I mean, a lot of them come in and haven't read Vonnegut. It used to be 20 years ago that everybody had read Vonnegut, but that's not really the case anymore. But students really, really appreciate his work. And it's often, the favorite thing that we'll do in the course of the semester.
What about Kurt Vonnegut's place in literary history? Can you kind of assess that? I mean, I know that authors some of them fade very quickly, others do not. Obviously, you and other professors are looking to keep his star aloft and bright. Is there a statement to be made about his place in literary history?
I think so. I mean, several scholars have written about the fact that in the 70s, especially, Slaughterhouse Five was a big hit, but he wasn't taken as seriously as a sort of literary writer, and by scholars or the sort of university community. And that was for a number of reasons. First of all, he was seen as sort of a cult writer. Some people argued that he appealed only to sort of the minimally intelligent young. That's actually a quote from a review of one of his books. And he was sometimes seen as sort of too simple, too accessible, too popular to be serious literature. I really think all that is changing, certainly. I feel like, especially since his death in 2007, that there has been just a sort of flood of very serious scholarship about Vonnegut that takes his writing very seriously and would put him on the level of writing serious literary fiction, even though it's fiction that's humorous and that's accessible. So I think his reputation is sort of changing, for the better.
Well, I certainly consider his writing to be experimental or avant-garde. Simple sentences, but the overall story is there's more complexity there. I mean, you alluded to that earlier.
Yeah.
It's not the easiest stuff to follow. What is he saying? I mean, you really need to suss out what he's communicating, because he does not he's not following a hard narrative or plot, and by any stretch.
That's very true. I mean, Slaughterhouse Five is a great example of that. It's very easy to read sentence by sentence. There's no difficult words, but Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. So the book does not follow a chronological or linear order. You jump back and forth from war scenes to Billy's being kidnapped by aliens and taken to another planet, to his life as an optometrist after the war. So yeah, in that sense, I think he plays with time and chronology and structure in a way that it shares a lot with other sort of what are called postmodern authors, even though his prose on the sentence level is very readable and easy to follow.
Now, you mentioned technology and how he said, we shouldn't be afraid of technology. We should have technology in our books because it's all around us these days. Yeah. And remember that our listeners should remember that, many people don't know that he worked for General Electric and was a copywriter for them, a public relations writer for General Electric. So he was surrounded by advanced technology and learned a good deal about that. And he was writing his fiction even as he was still working at General Electric before he decided to leave. And I believe at that time, when you would write magazine articles, you could make quite a bit of money writing magazine articles.
Yeah, that's true. In the 1950s, he would sell 3 stories a year, 3 or 4 stories a year, and be able to support himself. When television came into the home, that sort of market for short fiction in magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and Good Housekeeping and things like that sort of dried up a little bit. But you're right about the science. I mean, he was a biochemistry major at Cornell, although he didn't like it. He worked at General Electric. His first novel, Player Piano, came directly out of his experiences at General Electric. His older brother, Bernard, was an atmosphere scientist, a PhD scientist, and he knew and liked scientists. He hung out with scientists, often through his brother. So it was a world that he felt very comfortable in.
Do you think that Kurt Vonnegut was a depressive soul?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think so. His mother was a suicide. His mother committed suicide while he was in training for the Army at Camp Atterbury, which is about an hour south of where his home was in Indianapolis. And his mother overdosed on barbiturates and alcohol when he was home for Mother's Day in I believe it was just before he was shipped overseas.
And was it intentional? I mean, did she leave a note, or did it appear to maybe be accidental?
She did not leave a note, and the newspapers reported it as accidental, but Vonnegut has written in many essays that he believes it was intentional and that he calls it a suicide. So that's what the family believes, even though it was sort of hidden when it occurred.
Now, do you know his daughters?
I don't know them personally, but yeah.
Have you talked with them about any of the work you're doing, or has that not been necessary?
It hasn't really been necessary for me to talk with his daughters because, again, I haven't done that much biological work, biographical work. Sorry about that. The book I'm working on now really focuses on the writing of Slaughterhouse Five. And it doesn't go much beyond about 1970. His daughters were still, they were born in late 40s, early 50s, and his son, Mark, same age group. But because it's not really a biography of a person, my book that's upcoming is more of a biography of a book and the making of the book. It's got a lot of information about what it was like to be a prisoner of war in Germany. It's got a lot of information about the Dresden bombing and why that happened and what it entailed. It's got a lot of information about the strange historiography of Dresden. So I haven't really felt the need, I think, to actually contact his children about their experiences growing up, particularly.
So the story on Kurt Vonnegut is that he had his home office where he would write. He'd be in there for hours a day, oftentimes. But when he would come out to play, when he wanted to take a break, he'd come out and he would be like a child. He would run around and kick the ball and play tag, and he was very childlike at the same time, which his children loved, is my understanding. They loved that, but he was often very grouchy. And hold it down out there. I'm trying to write in here. How can I get any work done?
I mean, I think that's true, but I mean, he, as you know, as Charles Shields points out, he had a huge family, his own 3 children. And when his sister died of cancer 24 hours after her husband was killed in a commuter train crash, Kurt and his first wife, Jane Vonnegut, adopted initially the 4 boys of Kurt's sister, Alice. Eventually, the youngest, who was a baby, went to another family and another relative in Alabama, but they raised the 3 boys of Alice along with their own 3 children. So it was this big, loud, boisterous house in Cape Cod. Apparently, it was the center of, the kids' activities. Their friends would come over and hang out. So it was sort of a crazy, chaotic sort of place. And yeah, you're right. I mean, he would try to carve out time for himself to work. And I think, like anybody, could be pretty grumpy when he was working. With any writer, I'm sorry.
Like with any writer, you had those. You're trying to do brilliant work, and he did a lot of brilliant work, but only a fraction of what you produce is going to be brilliant. I'm sure there's a lot of frustration in that he just didn't feel like it was coming, not to his satisfaction. And then there's noise in the background, or somebody's knocking at the door saying, "Dad, can you come out and play?" or Uncle Kurt. I'm glad you reminded us, though, that yes, his sister's dying of cancer. His brother-in-law dies in it was a train or car accident?
It was a commuter train crash.
Train accident. And then she dies just hours or days later.
Yeah.
And he took the children, which, being a good sibling and doing the right thing, took those children on. So he had, 6? He had 3 of his own and 3 of his sisters?
Yeah, for about a year, they had 7 children. But eventually the youngest there was a big age gap between Alice's older boys and her youngest one, who was a baby. So eventually other relatives came and took care of the baby, but they did raise those 6.
Interesting. So, and he was living, he's at Cape Cod?
Yeah.
In Cape Cod. Okay. I mean, his home actually sounded like a lot of fun. All children running around, having a good time and bringing their friends over and all that. What a great childhood it sounded like. And then when dad or uncle comes out to play, and acts like a child himself, I'm sure it was just a great time. Now, you mentioned his first wife, Jane, who was, my understanding, she's very devoted to him, devoted to her family. He eventually divorced her because he met another woman, is my understanding. Is that right?
Well, according to Kurt Vonnegut himself and letters he wrote, he says that he and Jane were growing apart, especially after the children had grown up and left. There wasn't as much holding them together. And Jane also developed an interest in both sort of New Age spirituality and Christianity. And she became sort of a born-again Christian, and she dabbled in transcendental meditation and things like that. And I think that going in that direction for Kurt, who was sort of an agnostic, a free thinker, he's written about the fact that they went in these very separate directions. So, the way he writes about it, they were already pretty estranged and having problems before he met Jill Kremitz, who would become his second wife.
And he was working with Jill in some capacity. Is that right? Is that how they got close? He
wrote a play called Happy Birthday, Wanda June that was produced on Broadway in, I think, late 1970. So he was up in New York a lot doing, attending rehearsals, sort of finalizing the play. And she was a photographer. She actually had been a photographer in Vietnam, interestingly enough, but she sort of switched to portraits of writers. So she was on the set of the play doing some photography, and that's how they met, was on the set of Wanda June.
So Vonnegut's career spanned more than 50 years. He published 14 novels, 3 short story collections. Is that wrong? Is it not 14?
No, 14 is correct. Yep.
And then 3 short story collections, 5 plays, and 5 nonfiction works. Yeah, he, given the length of his career, that doesn't sound especially prolific. But it's not anything to be sneezed at either, especially since he was so successful, particularly with his novels and short stories, maybe the plays as well. I'm just not familiar with the plays, but it does seem that he spent a lot of time honing his craft, and that he didn't really let go of what he was working on until he really felt it was ready.
Yeah. One interesting thing, I was just in the Vonnegut archives at the Lilly Library in Bloomington, Indiana, which holds Vonnegut's papers. And one thing I was particularly interested in was early drafts of Slaughterhouse Five. And there are at least 20 drafts or fragments of drafts that just changed dramatically over time. He just worked on that book and wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. Originally, there's no character named Billy Pilgrim. The sort of Edgar Derby character is more the main focus of the book, although he's got a different name. So the drafts just changed tremendously, when he was in the most serious phase of working on it, which was probably around 1963 or 4, up until when it was published in 1969. So yeah, he worked and reworked things quite a bit.
And all of his novels were succinct, correct? I mean, he wasn't writing 700 or 1,000-page tomes. Yeah. He was writing 200, 250-page novels, roughly.
Exactly.
So is there anything about the fact that he always kept his novels very manageable, one might say? A lot of people are intimidated by long, big books and thinking this is just too long an engagement. Kurt Vonnegut really gave you a piece of work that could be absorbed in a respectable amount of time. And I think a lot of people would reread his works as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, he always said in Slaughterhouse Five, he says his novels are in the style of, Tralfamadorian novels, that they're like short telegrams strung together. And the beauty lays in seeing all those sort of brief, urgent messages sort of strung together. And one interesting thing is that he, in Slaughterhouse Five, when Billy is captured by the aliens, he's given the only novel that the aliens have on board the spaceship in English to read, which is Jacqueline Suzanne's Valley of the Dolls. And when Slaughterhouse Five was on the bestseller charts, another novel by Jacqueline Suzanne was also on the bestseller charts. And her novels are, I don't know if you've ever know much about her, but she wrote these extremely melodramatic, just Hollywood starlet, marries a man, divorces him, has an illegal child, just these melodramatic, really long novels. So I think in some ways he was sort of drawing attention to, the difference between his work and those sort of really long novels, which have, as he says in the book, ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs.
And I did read one of her books years ago. Yeah. It was what was the very famous one that exploded on the scene and made her famous?
I think it was Valley of the Dolls.
Valley of the Dolls. That's right. Yeah. It was entertaining. It's melodramatic, entertaining and melodramatic. And that's what a lot of readers are looking for. And it obviously paid off for her, but that's interesting. His perspective on that. Now, your research over the past few years has focused largely on American war literature. Mm-hmm. Why is that the case? What draws you to that, or what's the attraction there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really, I think, I started working on the Vietnam War writer Tim O'Brien. And I was actually introduced many, many years ago to the work of Tim O'Brien by a student who was a veteran and wanted to do sort of an independent study on Vietnam War literature. So I started reading a lot of Vietnam War literature, and I just fell in love and was bowled over by Tim O'Brien.
He wrote, didn't he win a Pulitzer for his novel? On the Vietnam War, there's one in particular. I read it myself. What was the title?
The Things They Carried is his most.
The Things They Carry. Yes, The Things They Carry, meaning the soldiers carrying things that were of meaning to them.
Yes, exactly. And that's sort of the short story cycle. It's a series of interrelated sort of short stories with the same characters. He also won the National Book Award back in 1978 for his novel Going After Cacciato. And that's a book about a soldier who deserts from Vietnam and is going to just decides to walk all the way to Paris. And the small platoon sort of go after Cacciato, attempting to bring him back. But then the question becomes, are they following Cacciato to bring him back, or are they also deserting the war as they follow him? So that's
They're going to be sitting in the American. They'll be sitting in the American Grill, talking about Hemingway and having cafe au laits. Just imagine.
Right.
Now, was that completely fictional, or was it based on? Did he know of somebody who went AWOL and actually headed for Paris?
No, that was completely fictional. But the work of Tim O'Brien is, I think, similar to the work of Kurt Vonnegut, and that can be really hard to sort out the reality from the fiction, because in Tim O'Brien's work, there's also a character named Tim O'Brien, who's not exactly the same as author Tim O'Brien. Just like in Slaughterhouse Five and other novels, Vonnegut always inserts himself, often in an opening chapter, a closing chapter, every now and then through the work. In an early draft of Slaughterhouse Five, in fact, Vonnegut makes a phone call to Billy Pilgrim late at night when he's been drinking, and actually talks to Billy Pilgrim on the phone. So that's sort of inserting sort of what seems to be his real self into the fictional world he's created. That's something that O'Brien does as well. So I think those two authors are quite similar in that way. And I think they're doing it to ask questions about sort of what's real and how do we know what's real and what's truth and what's not. And those kinds of big questions.
Absolutely. James Salter said, I saw there's just a little video clip on YouTube when he was an old man, and he just said, you reach a stage in life where you realize that nothing is real. It's as you look back, I think what he was saying is, as you look back over life, it's dreamlike. Did it really happen? It's just like waking up from a dream, and the past becomes fragile, just like a dream. I remember, I love the way John Updike worded it. He said something about he was reciting the dream to his wife or writing it down before the delicate structure was crushed by time. And that's the way dreams are. They're very delicate structure. In the past, you reach a certain age. I mean, I'm 63 now. I can think back to when I was in my 20s or 30s or 40s, into, my life with an ex-wife, and it almost seems dreamlike. And James,
I know exactly.
Salter,
yes. I mean, I'm 60. I look back at my younger self and think, who was that? That was a different person, almost a different character. I mean, so what Tim O'Brien talks about is how storytelling, this sort of has the same sense of reality as reality itself. I mean, in our own past lives, we almost become stories that we tell ourselves, right? That sort of dreamlike quality that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes. And this is one of the reasons I tell people there's really no such thing as fiction. Fiction is not, there are people who say, oh, I only read nonfiction. I only want to read about real stuff. And is that really real? I mean, especially if it's something like an autobiography. Their autobiographies are constantly pummeled because they say that they're just making stuff up about themselves. They're dropping names. They're sanitizing their life. They're not even talking about. Presidential biographies are huge that way. There's just kind of like, you wrote a whole book and left out scandals during your career, during your White House years. But it runs right across the board. Now, when you talk about Tim O'Brien and Kurt Vonnegut inserting themselves into their books, I wonder if Emmanuel Carrera, the French writer, when you read his books, it's hard to tell, is this fiction or is it nonfiction? And he put himself in the books as well. And wonder if he was influenced by Vonnegut and O'Brien, maybe some others.
It was larger than Vonnegut and O'Brien. I mean, during the 60s and 70s, during the period that we usually refer to as postmodernism, I mean, Norman Mailer put a sort of fictional version of himself named Norman Mailer into his book about the March on the Pentagon.
Yes.
Philip Roth, puts himself into his book, says Roth. So that idea of sort of mixing up or troubling the relationship between what's real, what's history, and what's fiction, I think is something that generation of writers was very much trying to do. I mean, they wanted to, I think, undo the binary, our belief that history is real and factual and that fiction is not, because that's sort of a naive belief, because how do we get to history except through representations of history?
Yeah. And then, if you're a fiction writer and you write something, the critics are always saying that it's autobiographical.
Right.
And, it's hard to argue that it's not necessarily autobiographical, but your own life experiences are the raw materials from which you mine it, and then you turn it into a piece of literature, or even just a piece of pop fiction for that matter. It's hard not to say that there isn't a whole lot of reality in there, or it's a fictional character who's representative of millions of people around the world who have gone through that. If you write about somebody who's suicidal, depressed, suicidal, a wandering soul, well, that's as real as anything. There's millions of people out there who are lost and depressed.
That's exactly true. Yeah.
It's sad, but it's it's all part of that mosaic of life. It's all part of the richness of life, and we don't always people often have trouble dealing with it properly. So interesting. So the book you have in progress on Kurt Vonnegut, again, talk about that one. What's the title of it?
The book's called The Good War and the Lousy Little Book, The Making of Slaughterhouse Five.
How did you research that and all? I mean, you went back, you were saying that you went to Bloomington. Why does Bloomington have the papers? Did they just bid on it and they outbid everybody?
Well, I think Vonnegut, he felt very strongly about Indianapolis as sort of being his hometown, and that his all his forebears are from Indianapolis, for 100 years. And, he talked often about the great education he received in the public schools in Indianapolis. I mean, in high school, he was a reporter on a daily newspaper, a newspaper that published every single day out of a high school. So he had a lot of fondness for his Indianapolis upbringing. So I think he wanted his papers to stay in the Indianapolis area. So it made sense that he wanted them to go to Bloomington. But yeah, most research libraries do pay authors, and they talk to authors that many libraries might give the authors bids. And it's not always the money that makes someone decide. There might be other reasons too, how accessible they're going to make the papers, how they're going to keep them. If there's sentimental reasons for them being in a certain place, an author would probably take that into consideration, which I'm sure Vonnegut did.
Yeah. So what is your method like for this book? You were looking at earlier drafts, so you kind of understood the evolution.
Yeah.
What other aspects do you bring to it?
Well, I talk a little bit about Vonnegut's Indianapolis upbringing. So I've done a lot of research into what Indianapolis was like in the 1920s and that kind of thing. And but probably the bulk of my research has been into the experiences of soldiers that fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the experience of soldiers in the 106th, which was Vonnegut's division. There's a lot published now by other survivors of Slaughterhouse Five and their experiences. I read a lot about the bombing of Dresden and why it was done and how people felt about it and the purpose behind it. And perhaps the sort of really most interesting part of the book is this sort of history of Dresden has been very troubled, because in Slaughterhouse Five, Vonnegut says he relies on a book by a British historian named David Irving called The Destruction of Dresden that was published in 1964. But that book was later shown to be error-ridden. Irving greatly exaggerated the number of people killed in Dresden, the number of civilians killed. Irving himself became a Holocaust denier. He was arrested in Austria and sentenced to 3 years in prison because he wasn't supposed to go in the country because he was a Holocaust denier. He sued an American historian over presenting him as a Holocaust denier, and that was actually made into a Hollywood movie called Denial. So the whole story of how we know about what happened in Dresden and how that's changed over the course of the years since it's happened has been really fascinating as well.
At what stage, I don't know if this question is even answerable, but at what stage do you think Vonnegut hit his apex as a writer or novelist?
Yeah.
Because, oftentimes you see somebody comes out with a hit novel, does very well with the first one, and then it's kind of downhill from there. Others, you see them just progressing over time as their technique and their skill improves.
Yeah. For me, honestly, it's often a writer's third or fourth novel, third through fifth. That's sort of the apex. And I sort of think that's true for Vonnegut. I love Mother Night. That was his third novel. It was published in 1961, I believe. That's just a fascinating book. It's about an American-born playwright who was raised in Germany and became a propagandist for the Nazis. But all the while, he was an Allied double agent sending coded messages. And so these are sort of his confessions. I think that book is a masterpiece. I think Cat's Cradle, which came right after Mother Night, is a masterpiece. But I do think I have to agree with the opinion of most scholars who think Slaughterhouse Five is really sort of the apex of his writing, because I think that book is just brilliant in so many ways. And I mean, I like books that came after, but I don't think he ever sort of reached that height of Slaughterhouse Five again.
So is it fair to say your favorite Vonnegut book is Slaughterhouse Five?
Yeah, with close second and third, probably being Mother Night and Cat's Cradle.
Yeah. And then he had a what was the short story collection that did so well? It's the I'm trying to think.
Welcome to the Monkey House. Was
Welcome to the Monkey House.
The one that had the biggest impact. Yeah.
Oh, here's another thing I remember from the biography that I read is that he was a college writing instructor for a while. Mm-hmm. And the students loved him because he encouraged students to take chances and when they do experiment. And that was not the case with most professors. Now, you made the point that he was never trained formally.
Right.
And then, so he didn't have that straitjacket on. And there's so many literature professors who would say, well, that's just not how you write it. That doesn't have the right tone. And that might be the case, but then, you're just kind of going to sound like everybody else.
Yeah.
And Vonnegut seemed very open to, do something different, experiment, let it fly.
I think especially when he was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, that he was a great teacher. I mean, he's got some of the most charming assignments that he gives his students. He will address his students in a 3-page assignment, and he'll address them as beloveds. And then he'll say, I want you to do this and do that and pick up this story and look at it with an open heart. And I mean, it's just, his assignments are whimsical and smart, and you can tell that he cares deeply about the students. I think a lot of the other writers at the Iowa Workshop especially were sort of phoning it in because they were sort of desperate to get their own work done. And I think later on, Vonnegut taught very briefly at Harvard and at City College, New York. And I think in those later experiences, he might have been a little bit phoning it in to make his own deadlines and things. But I think when he was at Iowa, 65 to 67, he was, I think he was really dedicated to teaching. And you're right, his students remember him as a great teacher. John Irving was one of his students, Gail Godwin, and he kept up lifelong relationships with these former students he had.
Oh, I didn't know that. So it was John Irving and Gail Godwin as well. Okay. So did you ever meet Kurt Vonnegut?
I never met him personally.
So he was tall, thin, big bushy hair, and smoked non-filter Camels incessantly, and lots of laughter, right? He used to laugh a lot. He'd talk to people, he'd laugh. Yeah. I would have loved to have seen, I didn't search YouTube yet, but I would love to have been at one of his commencement addresses. He didn't give you the standard speech, which of course would have been a disappointment. What do you know about that? Do you have any knowledge around how he approached his speaking engagements?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he would get pretty nervous about his speaking engagements, but I think he treated his speaking engagements like half as sort of stand-up comedy. He had sort of shticks and patter that he used. There's a great clip on YouTube of him talking about sort of the directions that stories can take. And this came out of a sort of master's thesis he wrote at the University of Chicago that was not accepted. It was turned down by the faculty. But there's a clip of him talking about this sort of structure of stories. And it's very funny. It could be like a stand-up comedian doing that. And he would often do that little segment in his talks. So I think audiences liked him because he was funny, he was accessible, he was never stuffy.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just, I've read a bunch of Vonnegut books, although there's still more to go. And I was just checking right now in my, electronic library here that Mother Night is not one I've read, but just based on what you said, I'm gonna buy it and I'm gonna read it.
Should.
Because it sounds, just based on what you said and the premise, sounds great. And I can see here it's highly rated. All of his novels are highly rated. His fans love him. And
what's your favorite that you've read so far?
I think it might be Breakfast of Champions or Mr. Rosewater. Is it called We Love You, Mr. Rosewater?
Yeah, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater.
God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. Yeah. But I don't know, Mother Night. I'm gonna dive into that. And of course, I've read Slaughterhouse Five as well, and that's just endless references to that book. You've been generous with your time, Susan. But before I let you go, I'm curious, what else can you tell us about Kurt Vonnegut, or what maybe I've overlooked? What maybe people should know about the writer or his books?
Yeah. He was, I think, one interesting thing that happened after he became famous, when Slaughterhouse Five was published, he was almost 50 years old, and he was 47, 48. And that book he became sort of an icon of the counterculture in the early 70s, because Slaughterhouse Five was published in 69. But he was really the parents' generation, a generation that said, don't trust anyone over 30. And he becomes this sort of icon. And he wasn't really part of that generation. But in the 70s, after he sort of attained fame, he became very outspoken about First Amendment rights. He was involved in several organizations that were worried about the freedom of writers living in sort of oppressive countries. Russia, for instance, the Soviet Union at the time. He worked to get Alexander Solzhenitsyn released from prison. So he did become involved in sort of, I think, global issues involving free speech and the freedom of writers to write what they wanted to write in a very active way. He's sort of often remembered by free speech organizations as a sort of, paragon of a champion of sort of First Amendment rights and free speech. His books were banned quite a bit. And, he often wrote letters to the school board that was banning his book. So that's an interesting aspect of him, his sort of, public persona as a champion of free speech and First Amendment rights. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it goes with the profession. It's great that he lowered his shoulder to that subject. And a lot of writers do. I mean, a lot of writers end up getting their works getting banned or so nowadays. It's amazing that now in modern era, we still see this stuff going on, and it's just deplorable.
Yeah.
To our listeners, I'm going to have a link to Susan Farrell's website at College of Charleston if you'd like to learn more about Susan and her work. And I also will have a link in the episode notes to the Kurt Vonnegut Society, International Kurt Vonnegut Society, which Susan is the founding member of. So you can learn more about Kurt Vonnegut if you're not already familiar with him. Of course, there's just scads and scads of material out there, including Susan's books, and then there's biographies and and just as even Wikipedia or what have you, to get a good primer. Susan, this has been great. Thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. And I'll look forward to your new book coming out.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. I've really enjoyed our time together, and I appreciate you thinking of me to have me on your show.